Good morning. This
Good morning.
is the second Sunday after Epiphany. And as we've been mentioning, the Epiphany season carries with it the theme of revelation. The word epiphany means to reveal something, to make it known. And so throughout the season, the different passages we will read will talk to us about how God is made known to us. And the Gospels will all talk about how Jesus, the man, was also Jesus, the Son of God. Recall on Epiphany Sunday 2 weeks ago, we had the story of the wise men who brought gifts worthy of a king to Jesus, indicating his royalty. And then last week, Jesus agreed to be baptized, and we had the voice from heaven that proclaimed him to be God's beloved Son. I can only imagine what it would be like if someone today, if Gary came in and said, I had a voice from heaven that proclaimed I was his beloved son. We'd probably make arrangements for a mental health intervention. But in Jesus' time, that was a lot more common. And then this morning, on the second Sunday after Epiphany, we have a lesson from the prophet Isaiah, and then our psalm talks about the restoration of Israel. The gospel lesson is Jesus at a wedding in Cana, performing the first of his, what we would call miracles. John calls them signs. And then the New Testament lesson, we're going to spend several weeks with Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, talking about spiritual gifts. So let's start with the Isaiah passage. The return of the exiles and the rebuilding of Jerusalem is a constant theme throughout the book of Isaiah. There's an old expression, where there's breath, there's hope. And that certainly applies here. Israel is referred to by Isaiah as Zion, which has multiple meanings. The word Zion now refers to the nation of Israel. In fact, if we were to look at it from a political perspective, we would see that a lot of the inhabitants of Israel are not so much followers of the Jewish religion as they are Zionists. It's that mentality they've developed ever since 1948, when the state of Israel was reestablished by the United Nations. And it's that notion, and we certainly saw that in the history since then with the different wars that they've had with neighboring countries. Nobody is ever going to step on us again. And so here in the Old Testament lesson, we hear about Zion, which originally referred to one of the oldest sections in the city of Jerusalem, one of the high points in the city geographically. And it's an allusion not just to the city, but also to the nation of Israel itself. These are people who were carried away into Babylon, spent many years there in exile, and have now come back to discover the country is in ruins. I think if we were to come up with an analogy for that today, it might be looking at the people who had to evacuate because of the fires that happened here in California. But then when they finally get permission to return, they discover that their home is in ruins and all their possessions have been destroyed. It's that kind of an attitude that the Hebrews had when they came back into their homeland. But Isaiah is writing to give them a sense of hope, because the God who has been with them from the days of Abraham is with them today. And so now he's reminding them that God is going to establish the righteousness of Judah and of Israel, the two countries that were once one. So let's look at Isaiah 62. And he writes, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory. And you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you." What a marvelous passage to get a sense of hope for the future. I think of the couples whose weddings I've performed. Now, we know statistically that a lot of these marriages don't last very long. But I've never had a wedding that I've performed where the couple stood up there and said, "I take you to be my bride for about 2.5 years. And then you're going to discover another guy is more interesting than I am. And so we're going to fight for a while, and then maybe it'll get pretty ugly, and then we'll go our ways." No. It's always till death do us part. And they're all sincere when they make that promise. God promises to be with us not just till death, but beyond it. So Isaiah's passage is really significant for us. This morning we have the middle portion of Psalm 36. That's our psalm for today. The psalm calls for all of us to praise God for his goodness despite human wickedness. Now, to appreciate what we're going to read, I need to put it in context for you. Because the first 4 verses of the psalm talk about wickedness and defines wickedness for us. The thoughts, the words, and the actions of a wicked person. And then at the end of the psalm, we hear once again about how wickedness exists in this world. But in verses 5 through 9, we have a hymn of praise that God is the perfect contrast to wickedness. This hymn explores God's character in verses 5 and 6, and then with the things that God does to save and protect us in the second half of 6 and on through verse 9, talking about how God is there on behalf of those who seek refuge. The wicked are set on destroying relationships. God exists to establish and maintain them. So turn please to page 232, and we'll read in unison, since I haven't got my hymnal in front of me, Psalm 36, verses 5 through 10. Would somebody start us, please?
Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens, and your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the strong mountains, your justice like the great deep. You save both man and beast, O Lord. How priceless is your love, O God. Your people take refuge under the shadow of your wings. They feast upon the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the well of life, and in your light we see light. Continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your favor to those who are true of heart.
Paul's first letter to the Corinthians could very easily have been written to a congregation today in our society. In fact, in many ways, Corinth is a lot like contemporary cities, such as Los Angeles or Boston or New York. Cosmopolitan areas, where you've got a mixture of races and ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, and religious beliefs. Corinth was a seaport, so a lot like LA, a lot of commerce, and a lot of traders from different nations. There were some Jews there, and on one of his missionary journeys, Paul establishes a congregation. He has now left them and moved on, but the congregation is struggling. And so he gets reports from someone named Chloe that there are some issues that need to be addressed in the Corinthian congregation. And one of them, curiously, was how we express our faith and how we live out our Christian lives. You've heard me say a number of times before that religion is the system of beliefs and doctrines that establishes a church body and keeps it going. That's to be distinguished from spirituality, which is the relationship we have with God. Now, that's not to say one is better than the other, or that one is right and the other is wrong. Because if you have spirituality but no sense of doctrine, then you have no foundation. If you're all doctrine, all head knowledge, but don't have a relationship with God, then it's just words. And one of the things that Paul addresses in this letter is how to put those two concepts together. And for him, it's all about the work of the Holy Spirit. It's the Spirit that engages with us both individually and corporately. We talk about how at baptism, God gives us his Spirit. Now, it may be that we're not aware that has happened to us, at least not on a cognitive, intellectual level. But then as we grow, we realize that the Spirit is there to engage with us and to help us live our lives. Paul is an excellent writer. And so at the beginning of our passage for today, he starts off and says, now concerning, it's his way of saying I'm bringing up a new topic. And so here he's talking about spiritual gifts. But before he gets into the spiritual gifts themselves, which will be in chapter 12, he starts off by setting a foundation for that argument in chapter 11, where he talks about matters of the Spirit. And it's his indication that the Spirit we have blesses each of us in a unique and individual way. And so what the Spirit does for Carolyn might not be the same as what the Spirit does for Donna. That doesn't make either manifestation better, just different. And in Paul's time, and as it is today, the Spirit sometimes leads people and blesses people with a spiritual gift. Now, the Greek word for that is charismata. We get the English word charismatic from that. We think of public speakers who are very charismatic with their personalities. That's how they get elected to office. I've never known a dull person to be elected. No, you've got to have a personality that people are drawn to. But in this case, charismata refers to the gifts that God gives. And what I found fascinating in researching this was that the root word for charismata is the Greek word charis, which means grace. So whatever gift you've got, you receive as a result of God's grace. And he talks about how this grace from God is what enables us to be Christians. It's what enables us to confess our faith and to say that Jesus is Lord. Now this morning we're going to recite the Nicene Creed, which we do on Communion Sundays. On other Sundays we use the words of the Apostles' Creed out of our hymnal. And once a year on Trinity Sunday, we read the Athanasian Creed. We don't do it often because it takes an entire page of small print, going into great detail about how God is revealed to us as Creator, Redeemer, and Spirit. But in the early church, to say Jesus is Lord is probably the simplest of all the creedal expressions. So let's hear what Paul has to say in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, "Let Jesus be cursed." And no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given the Spirit, through the Spirit, the utterance of wisdom. To another, the utterance of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another, faith, by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing, by the one Spirit. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the discernment of spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. And this is our second lesson. I don't know what your ethnic backgrounds are. I'm half German and half Sicilian. I can't speak too much about German weddings. I haven't attended very many of those. But I do recall as a youngster going to Italian weddings. There was a ceremony in the church, and then came the reception. And it went on for hours. And there were all kinds of rituals associated with the Italian wedding reception. My favorite was always when the bride would sit on a little stage with her mother, and the bride would hold this silk purse in her hands, and everybody would line up to come and wish the bride well and to put their envelope into the bag. Mama's job was to stand there and evaluate the thickness of the envelope to make sure that the gift you were giving was of significant size. Jewish weddings are a remarkable experience. It starts off at the home of the bride, where the father of the bride takes his daughter by the hand and leads her out into the streets of the village. And they always take the most winding and longest route through the streets so that people could come out in their doorways and offer congratulations and greetings. And then finally they arrive at the home of the groom. And that's where the wedding took place, at the front door of the groom's home. And it was typically a very short ceremony. But then the parade would continue. And there would be a cloth called a chuppah, C-H-U-P-P-A-H, a large, like a bed sheet held by 4 poles at each corner. It's to symbolize God's grace over you. And so that would be held over the head of the bride and groom as they would wander through the village, once again getting congratulations from friends and neighbors. They finally arrive at the reception hall, where a week-long celebration would begin, all of which was paid for by the groom's parents. Unlike today's society, where the groom's parents are responsible for taking everybody to Sizzler for the rehearsal dinner, and then the bride's parents are expected to pay for everything. There would be feasting, there would be dancing, there would be celebrating, and there would be wine. And we want to be clear about this. The fact that there was an abundant amount of wine did not mean that everybody got verschnickered, because drunkenness was considered inappropriate and disgraceful. Wine symbolizes celebration. It symbolizes life. Now, if you've ever attended a Passover Seder, Seder is the word that means ceremony. At one point in the ceremony, they have you take your glass of wine, and as they recite the 10 plagues that were visited upon the people when they were in Egypt, you are to dip your finger into the wine and tap 1 drop onto your plate, reducing the volume of wine and symbolically reducing your celebration. So this feast goes on. Someone is appointed to be the steward of the feast. We might call that the maitre d' today. And it was that person's job to make sure the food was prepared, served hot, the beverages were ample and served frequently, and to make sure you had enough wine. To run out of wine was scandalous, because that meant you'd run out of celebration. I can recall being at a wedding reception where they ran out of alcoholic beverages, and so the groomsmen went across the street to the local package store and purchased cases of beer and bottles of spirits and brought them back. Their concern was not so much to keep the celebration going, but to keep the inebriation from coming to an end. So now we have this wedding. It's in a small village in Cana, and Jesus is an invited guest. Now, I love using this passage when I meet with prospective brides and grooms to talk about the fact that Jesus was invited to be at that wedding. And I talk to them about inviting Jesus to their wedding, not necessarily at a reception, but into the marriage itself. And really, the only way to have Jesus be a part of your marriage is to have Jesus be a part of your life. And so the bride and groom, as they share Jesus with one another, bring Jesus into the relationship. But Jesus is an invited guest, which tells me that he and his family probably knew the groom's family. In fact, it would not be too far a stretch to suspect that Jesus and the groom were friends and had grown up together. And while they're sitting there and enjoying, we're not told what day of the week it was. It may have been the first day of the celebration. It may have been the 5th day of the celebration. But they run out of wine. And Mary comes to Jesus and tells him, "We're out of wine." And Jesus' reaction is, "Yeah, so?" He calls her woman and says, "What does that have to do with me? It's not my time yet." It almost sounds disrespectful. You know, he doesn't call her mother, he doesn't call her mom or mommy or anything romantic or intimate like that. But the word that is used here is actually a term of respect. It's like calling someone a lady today. And I love Mary's response to Jesus. She ignores it. He says, it's not my concern. And so instead, she just turns to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you to do. Then she goes away. And so Jesus turns to the servants and has them fill these big pitchers of water. And to say pitcher is really a misnomer. It's like a big jar, literally 4 feet high. It held gallons and gallons of liquid. And they filled them with water right up to the brim. And then he tells the servants, draw out a ladleful and take it to the steward of the feast. The man tastes it. And he goes to the groom and says, what's wrong with you? Everybody at a wedding reception serves the good wine first. And then when everybody's drunk, they bring out the cheap stuff. You've saved the best until last. This is the Gospel according to John, the 2nd chapter, beginning at the 1st verse.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Glory to you, O Lord. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And he said to her, woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each one holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, fill the jars with water. And they filled them to the brim. He said to them, now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. You notice in the last verse there that John refers to it as not a miracle, but a sign. It was a way that Jesus was able to display to the people who he was and the power he had. And this is our lessons for today.